好大个식사와 홀리려가 talking Taiwan 시사. 但是我的语不是很好，所以我不通用台语演讲，所以我不用英语。我的语拢听就是看韩文讲。So I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in English. It's easier for me. I can speak Taiwanese and I can understand Taiwanese, but I'm more fluent in English, so I'll be doing my presentation in English today. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to meet everybody and for everybody to get to know me and the work that I'm doing. Um, I'm going to be talking about Talking Taiwan, which is a podcast. Hopefully, most people know what a podcast is. A podcast is basically like a sort of internet radio. So you can listen to different programs on your phone or on your computer. And I'm the host and producer of Talking Taiwan. I've been hosting Talking Taiwan since 2013. In the beginning, I was just the host, and then in around 2019, I became the producer of the show. Um, okay. I'm based in New York City right now. I did live in Taiwan for about 6 years, from 2001 to 2007. And that was a really interesting experience for me. And at that time, I um, came to hear about somebody named Subing, who is Isha Shiba Nisu, Taiwan Langa Shiba Nisu. I heard about him, and I was really, he has an incredible life story. And so I wanted to meet him, and I started to interview him about his life. Okay, so here's my presentation. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, I don't know if there's an echo or delay. I apologize. I don't know what's going on. Okay. Okay, so I want to introduce myself and to let you know what motivates my work for Taiwan, because I've actually spent a lot of my life doing work in one form or another of Taiwan. And let's see, can I go to the next? I'm trying to move the slide now. Let's see.
Let me see how to move.
Ah, there we go. Okay. So everything, of course, begins before me with my parents. So this is a photo of my parents with me in Alaska, which is where I was born. But what you don't see in the story is the backstory and what it took for them to get here to start their life together in the US, and to bring me in the world. So the story is that after my parents got married in Taiwan, my dad was a professor at the University of Alaska, and he actually had to leave Taiwan without my mom because my mom was not allowed to leave Taiwan. The Kuomintang government would not allow her to leave, so he had to go back. And they were separated as newlyweds for quite a few months. And while my mother tried to apply for exit visa, she was denied. And it was a very emotional and intense time for them. And during that process, she discovered that her older brother, who was in Canada, had been blacklisted because he had spoken out in support of Peng Ming, who was, as most of you know, wrote the Declaration of Independence and then was under house arrest, escaped to Sweden and Canada. And my uncle had spoken in support of Peng Ming and written some articles against the Kuomintang. So she found this out in the process of trying to get out of the country. So it was a really big time of uncertainty. And at one point, my grandmother, my mother's mother, even said to her, "You may need to consider to divorce your husband if there's no resolution." Meanwhile, my father, who was in Alaska, He, with the help of the other professors at University of Alaska, put pressure on the U.S. senators to try to get my mother released. He asked the U.S. senators to put pressure on uh, the Republic of China government. And they had a lot of tough decisions. My father had to consider whether he was going to give up his career and go back to Taiwan to be with my mother. My mother had to consider if she was going to, uh, if she was able to get out of Taiwan, maybe she would never be able to go back. Eventually, they got the right people to put pressure on the Kuomintang, and my mother was granted permission to leave. But it was really a very dramatic and traumatic experience going through all these months of uncertainty. And I didn't learn this until about 5 years ago that when my mother went to, there was some kind of interview that she had to go to, and she was accompanied by a family friend. I think he probably worked for the police or something like that. And he told her, he brought her to the interview and he said, if you don't come out of the interview in a certain time, I'll come and get you. And then also, she told me that she went into a windowless room where they basically interrogated her, and they told her that her brother had written these articles and that she had to promise, she had to write some statement to say she would tell him to stop doing that and she would not do any media interviews about what happened to her. So I didn't even learn that until 5 years ago. Um, so later on, my parents immigrated to Canada, which is where all my mother's siblings lived at one time. So I was very close to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. My cousins were like my brothers and sisters. And every year, my cousins would go back to Taiwan during the summer to visit their Dawanagong and Dawanama. And we never went back to Taiwan. And I was always wondering why that was. And I learned about my parents' story and I understood what they went through. And over the years, they made several attempts to apply for a visa, but there's always some kind of very strange circumstance. And again, I didn't know what was going on as a kid. I learned later on that um, they would just get very strange answers like, you know why your visa's being delayed. And it was a form of harassment that my parents went through. So all of this really left a really big impression on me as a kid. And I was always curious about Taiwan. I was wondering what was the situation there, what kind of government would subject its citizens to this kind of treatment. And I also learned about, the authoritarianism and the oppression of the Kuomintang. Growing up at home, we always spoke Taiwanese, and I learned that my parents were very insistent about that because the Kuomintang was enforced Mandarin Chinese as the official language, and they punished people for speaking Taiwanese. So that also left a really huge impression on me. And my family, we didn't visit Taiwan until after martial law was lifted. So then when I went to the University of Illinois, that was the first time that I was away from home. And I really found a sense of community by joining the Taiwanese American Students Club, which was just forming. And it was the first time that I met a lot of other Taiwanese students who actually had similar backgrounds to me, whose parents had been blacklisted and not allowed to return to Taiwan. And it was still the White Terror era. And so several of us organized a group called the Intercollegiate Taiwanese American Students Association. And that organization is still in existence. Okay, I don't think I have control to advance. Okay, thank you. So this group is called the Intercollegiate Taiwanese American Students Association, and it's still in existence today, which is really quite amazing. What this group does is that it organizes regional conferences, like so student conferences in the Midwest or East Coast. So one college will host a conference, and then other schools, other colleges in that region will go to that school for the conference. And the conference will be about things related to Taiwan, Taiwan issues, culture, and Taiwanese identity. So it's pretty amazing that this organization is still in existence. Then after I graduated from college, a lot of us wanted to um, continue this community. So we started an organization called the Society of Taiwanese Americans. It was meant to be a continuation from ITASA, and I was very involved with that for several years. Um, for me, I remember Taiwan under martial law. I remember Taiwan under White Terror era. And I also, of course, witnessed Taiwan's first, the transition to the democratic transition of Taiwan and the first presidential election. So, okay, could you advance to the next slide? Thank you. So as we know, like the first election was between Li Jinghui and Peng Mingming. And I also remember that at the time when we had that election, that China was actually lobbing missiles across the Taiwan Strait to try to intimidate the people who were voting. And it's really incredible to think that even now, decades later, that China still um, has this kind of attitude and tactic against Taiwan. Could we go to the next slide? So my program, Talking Taiwan, we actually cover things related to this. So recently and this happens almost on a daily basis, as I'm sure a lot of you know, there was a breach of Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So we did an episode about that. What does that mean? And then talking about how this is really nothing new in terms of China's behavior towards an attitude towards Taiwan. And I remember that it was very hard when I was in college and after college, before 2000, it was very hard to get good English language news about Taiwan. And one of the best resources was the Taiwan Communique. And I also had the opportunity to interview Garrett Vanderwees, the publisher of Taiwan Communique. It was a really interesting interview. And I hope that it introduced people to this wonderful resource, which is still available online. And so now, it's really incredible, okay, we can stop here for a minute. The democratic transition of Taiwan, it's one of the most democratic nations in Asia, and we really can't let the democracy that Taiwan fought so hard to be taken away, and we need to safeguard its democracy and freedoms. And so that's a big reason why I do what I do with Taiwan and with Talking Taiwan. And so after many years of doing work with the Taiwanese American community, I decided to move back to Taiwan in 2001 to discover my roots and to understand the situation in Taiwan. And as I mentioned before, oh, I didn't, sorry, I apologize. While I was there, I did actually study Taiwanese and because I realized my Taiwanese was actually like not very fluent. I would speak half Taiwanese and half English at home. And then later on, I came to a point that I realized that I should probably learn Mandarin Chinese as a practical matter. And so I did start taking classes, but then the funny thing is that I realized that I actually had some kind of a mental block to learning Mandarin because I knew the history behind the oppression, and it's still kind of awkward for me to speak Mandarin Chinese. I did get to a point where I was able to speak conversationally, but never really to the point of being able to read Chinese. would have taken a significant more time investment for me to do that. So after being in Taiwan for a couple of years, I was thinking, what was my purpose being there? And I always felt that I wanted to write something related to Taiwan. And one day I was reading an article in the Taipei Times, which was an English article, which was a translation of something written by Su Bing. And it was an article about human rights. It wasn't even about Taiwan or Taiwan independence necessarily. So I was kind of curious, and I asked my mother, "Do you know who the author of this article is?" And she told me, "Oh yeah, Su Bing. He wrote 台湾西半尼四, and he went to China. He worked with the communists. He got a vasectomy while he was working for the communists because he was so dedicated to his work, and all these incredible stories." And I was just really amazed and gripped by this. I'm like, this is a real person. I want to interview this person. Initially, like, I'm not a historian and I'm not a biographer. Initially, I wanted to just interview him and maybe write a story based on his life. But after I started talking to him, I realized that his life was very interesting without having to fictionalize it. And I always remember the first time that I met him, I asked him, could I interview him and write something about him? And his answer was, uh, 真的为台湾好. If it's for the good of Taiwan, yes. Um, so that was, yeah, it's been quite an amazing experience, and it's been a very long-term project. There's a lot of translation involved. And the funny thing is that um, I didn't know that my parents actually had the Taiwan's 400-year history book on their bookshelf the whole time when I was growing up. And I had no idea about this, and I had found out about Su Bing on my own. Can we go to the next slide? So this is a photo of me and interviewing Su Bing, and we can go to the next one. I love this photo. This is a really amazing photo. This is the day that the last day of the sunflower movement. This is Su Bing with his assistant. I was fortunate enough to be in Taiwan during that time to witness the whole thing. And this was the day that they left the Li Fa Yuan. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so I want to talk about Talking Taiwan now. In 2012, the producer of Talking Taiwan, Gus Adapon, reached out to me because he was looking for a female podcasting host. And he asked me, do you know anyone who would be able to do this? And actually, I didn't even know what podcasting was at that time. That was 9 years ago. And I had no idea like who to recommend for that. But then as I thought about it, I was like, this is a really interesting opportunity. So I said, I'll volunteer myself. I'll do it. um, so I learned how to be a host, how to record the interviews and do all these things. And I was very fortunate because the producer had a sound engineer and he did everything. So I just needed to have the equipment to record the interviews, and then I would schedule the guests. And it ended up being something that came very naturally to me because I've worked in the Taiwanese community for so long. It was not hard for me to find guests. Some of the guests that I interviewed in those early days was Brian Yang, who is the producer of Linsanity, the Jeremy Lin movie. And I also interviewed Andrew Yang very early on when he was working with Venture for America. So way, way, way before his political aspirations. Um, so I did that for a couple years as the host, and we really didn't have any method meaning that we didn't have a regular schedule. I was just kind of doing this volunteer We went through some stops and starts, so it wasn't very consistent. And then in 2017, Gus, the producer, decided to step down. He had some family obligations and different reasons that he wanted to step down. And then he very generously said to me, if you want to continue the podcast, I can give it to you. You can just take it over. So of course, I was happy to do so. But then my role changed. I would have to be the producer in addition to being the host. Um, I wasn't exactly sure how to do that because I don't do the sound editing and I don't wish to do that. So I needed to find a partner to do that. And fortunately, as it turns out, my partner, my producing partner, and my sound engineer, he does the website and everything, is actually my boyfriend. So he's a musician and he's trained in sound engineering. So that was really very serendipitous that he agreed to partner with me and help me to produce the show. And he's been such a integral part of this, getting the show out every week. So I have him to thank for that. So in 2019, we relaunched Talking Taiwan. Um, and in the beginning, we did bi-weekly episodes, so every other week. Um, but then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, a lot of things like really slowed down for both of us. And so we decided to use that time to focus on Talking Taiwan, and we went to a weekly schedule that we would publish a new episode every week. And in fact, in some weeks, we actually released more because we released some old episodes. And we've definitely seen a growth in the listenership. We are now ranked in the top 5% of all podcasts in the world. There is a service that ranks podcasts if you're the top 10% or 5%. We recently got into the top 5%. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from our listeners. People sometimes contact me on social media and tell me that they really enjoyed um, certain episodes and things like that. So it's been a really huge learning experience that it's important to be very consistent and that people are really enjoying our content. And we've also gotten a lot of reviews for our podcast. Now I want to talk about the purpose of Talking Taiwan. Oh, we can stay on that last slide. We can go back maybe. Um, okay. So the purpose of Talking Taiwan is because, as I mentioned before, well, I think we still need to protect and safeguard Taiwan. And I believe that one way by doing that is by improving the awareness of Taiwan and garnering support for Taiwan from people all around the world. And Talking Taiwan, in a way, is a soft way to introduce people to Taiwan, initially through personal interest stories. So the most important part of the programming is the personal interviews. So I do personal interviews with people who they don't have to be Taiwanese. There are people who are doing things that are related to Taiwan or who have some kind of connection with Taiwan. And the second type of episode that I do is Taiwan related news events. So if there's something in the related to Taiwan, like I showed you with the air defense air defense zone, or with the coronavirus or the pineapple ban, we did episodes on things like that. And the third type of episode that I do is something related to current events or social issues, things that I think are interesting to my listeners. Okay, so let's see, we can go. Great. So here's an example of a personal interview I did. This is with the owners of Winson, which is the Taiwanese restaurant. And this was a really interesting interview because I was just expecting to talk to them about how they set up their restaurant and what kind of food that they serve. But what was very interesting to me was they told me about how they started their restaurant and then they went back to Taiwan to do some research. And they actually, a lot of their research was to understand the history and the background of Taiwan. So we got into a discussion about that. And they actually um, met with someone else who I interviewed. Okay, can we go to the next? Okay, so this is Jerome Keating. He's written several books about the history of Taiwan, and this is actually one of our most popular episodes. So the owners of Winston in the previous slide had actually met with Dr. Keating, and they were talking to him about the history of Taiwan because they really wanted to understand Taiwan's history and culture and to kind of incorporate that in their restaurant. It's very interesting if you go to their restaurant. It's in East Williamsburg. All their servers refer to the dishes by their Taiwanese names. Like I remember I was there and I asked them about the oyster pancake, and the server said to me, "Oh, you mean the oajen?" So it was really interesting to see that. And then let's go to the next one. Okay. I also interviewed the documentary filmmaker. She did a film about Labo, Taiwan, which is very interesting. Basically, the interesting thing about this interview was that she said that even though the Love Boat program was in a lot of the people that went on the Love Boat program were sort of indoctrinated by the Kuomintang, but in the end, what it actually ended up happening was that it made people it deepened their affection for Taiwan. And actually, I think it actually had the opposite effect that a lot of people that went on that program actually have a really strong affection for Taiwan. And yeah, it was very interesting to see how that flipped. I also interviewed Tony Coolidge, who is a part indigenous. He grew up in America, and after his mother passed, he found out that she was. He went back to Taiwan, and he discovered his indigenous roots. And now he lives in Taiwan and does a lot of work with the indigenous people in Taiwan. Okay. I also recently interviewed Eva Liu. She has a children's publishing book company, and it was just a very interesting interview to hear how she runs her business. And she's also a writer, and is writing something that's related to to one of her relatives that's related to the White Terror era in 228. Okay, we can go to the next one. So as far as Taiwan related events, when the coronavirus hit, Taiwan had a very good response. And at one point, Taiwan was the only place in the world that had professional um, sports. And so I interviewed Richard Wong, who is the English announcer of the Taiwan baseball games at the time. Okay, let's continue. Um, Also, recently we had the pineapple ban, so I interviewed this Taipei Times columnist to talk about this, so that people could be aware of like what was the situation, what was going on. Okay. And as I mentioned before, I also had Eric Chang, who writes for Taiwan News, to talk about the breach of Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Okay. And most recently, I interviewed Courtney Donovan Smith, who is the ICRT correspondent for Central Taiwan, and he talked about what has been happening in Taiwan, and why there was an increase in the coronavirus cases. As for current events and social issues, this was a very interesting interview. I interviewed this group called the Anti-Sewing Squad. The Anti-Sewing Squad is a group of volunteers who started sewing masks, and they do it voluntarily in their free time. And they sew masks for at-risk communities that cannot afford them or need them. So initially they started off helping healthcare workers, but then they started helping like migrant workers, farm workers, uh, the Navajo nations, like uh, the people on the reservations, and so people who really don't have access to PPE. Let's go to the next one. I also did several episodes about Asian hate. Unfortunately, as we know, in this environment, there's been an increase in Asian hate um, incidents. So I interviewed Sue Lan and her son, who actually um, had somebody harassing them, and they talked about what happened to them and how they dealt with the situation. And also had the opportunity to organize a panel. So we had a online panel discussion about what to do if you're the target of Asian hate. And we had several panelists. Some of these people were my guests on the podcast. We had a police officer, a lawyer, and Peter and Sulan, who had experienced Asian hate crimes. Okay. Okay. So you may be wondering, what is the future of Talking Taiwan? What are my future plans? So, okay, we can go to the next slide. Um, so the first thing is I want to make the podcast financially stable and secure to ensure its continuation. Of course, my partner and I would like to be compensated for the time that we spend on this to cover our operating expenses and to upgrade our equipment. We do this every week, and we take it very seriously. It's like a full-time job. And we hope to follow the public radio model. So we're asking people who believe in the value of what we're doing to support us. And we do have some supporters right now. Let's continue. We would like to grow the listenership through other partnerships with other podcasts, and perhaps if it's necessary, do some paid advertising to get the podcast more exposure. We'd like to be able to pay for a translator if we want to do bilingual episodes. We do have one interview with the director of a film called Small Talk, which is a bilingual interview, and that was actually arranged through the Austin Film Festival. They arranged for the translator because this is not really typical for us to have a translator. But in the future, if we had some guests that are not English speakers, it would be great to be able to do a translated episode so they could have simultaneous translation. Oh, can we go back? I was missed. Let's see. Okay, and then possibly we would like to have some written transcripts of episodes. Perhaps they could be in both Chinese or in English. Okay, go ahead. Other things that we consider is maybe we would produce more than one episode a week, or we could have a second podcast host. Okay. So how can you help us? How can you support Talking Taiwan? Of course, you can make a financial contribution, or you can help us to raise funds. And you can do that by visiting Talking Taiwan, and you can click on the button Support Us. Go to the next page. This is our website. Excuse me. Let's go next. And we are currently on Patreon, and people can support us at different levels. We do have some people that are supporting us at more. We do have one person right now that's supporting us as more than 100 a month, so we're very grateful for that. Okay, let's go to the next page. You can also support us by listening to the podcast. You can go to any of these websites or apps on your phone, and if you go to the app and you just type in Talking Taiwan, you can find the podcast, and then you can listen to our episodes. You can also just tell others about the podcast and let them know about it so they can listen to it too. You could also rate and review Talking Taiwan. If you write a review on Apple, that helps people to know about it because it improves the ranking of the podcast on Apple, and people will be able to discover it more easily. I have a couple slides if people don't know how to rate and review it. You just have to open your app. This is if you have an iPhone or iPad only, so it's for Apple users. You go to the icon, which is the podcast icon, and then go to the next slide. You have to search for the podcast and type in Talking Taiwan, and we go to the next slide. Then the podcast will come up and you'll see something that looks like this. Then you have to scroll down to the bottom. So you can only do this on an iPhone or an iPad. You can't do this on the computer, unfortunately. And you'll see something that says write a review. And then when you click write a review, you'll be able to write something about the podcast. And the last thing that you could do is that you can support us by suggesting a guest for Talking Taiwan. If you think there's someone interesting that I could interview, I'd be happy to take people's suggestions. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything that I have to say, and this is my contact information. I don't know if people are on social media, but the most important one is the email. So if you're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or you can just email me, and my website is at the very bottom. So yeah, so I'm happy to take any questions or have any discussion and open it up to if anybody has any comments or questions for me. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.